Now we're going to prepare and sew both the sleeve and the cuff. And it's quite important that you watch out from the start when you're working this, that the front of the sleeve and the front of the cuff are actually in line with each other and sit on the front of the blouse. And you can get it wrong, and when we're sewing it together, I'm giving you a few tips and tricks, obviously, how you get this right. But basically the front is always cut away a little bit more than the back, which comes up higher, and that way you know which one is which. You also should have snipped it. If you haven't snipped the front, do it now. Snip the front off the sleeve, off the cuff, so you don't get it wrong. And then we're going to put our gather threads in first at the top, and we're also going to put gather threads in here so that we can make it fit the cuff. And on your sleeve you have a measurement, it says gather to 5 or 4.5 or whatever it is, depending on the size, but literally you just pull the gather threads to fit the cuff and you're fine. So let's get started. Now we're going to prep up our sleeves. So what we want to do is put a gather thread, maybe from here, fairly low down, all the way around close to the edge, and then we do another one foot width next to it, and then we can gather it and possibly not even secure it with a pin, right? That's why I start fairly low down, then I'll just gather them up there and I can leave the threads hanging, and I don't need to secure them by wrapping them around a pin. That's the reason why I start lower down here. And you also need to put gather threads into the lower edge. And I'm going about half a foot in once round. And now we're going foot width next to that. And then I do it on the lower edge as well, and I can actually sew this in. That's okay as well. Go to the other side. Okay, foot width next to it. Before we sew the sleeve together, we now need to serge the sides so that they're nice and neat. If you don't have a serger, you can also do a French seam at this point. And now we just want to pop on the sewing machine and close our sleeves here. 1 centimeter seam allowance. You can close them one after the other so that you don't waste any thread. Now we're going to iron the seam apart. Now we're going to work our turn-ups, and you need to make sure that you have a pair, which is why when I ironed on my interfacing, I always do it on the one pair and then split them up, because that way I make sure that I don't get two that are the same. So here we go. Now, if you don't want to put piping in, you just simply sew that together. If you want to put the piping in, we're going to put the piping to the side which has got the interfacing on first. And then I'm just going to put a pin in here, let this wander along a little bit. And when I know how much I need, I'll just cut it off so there's a little bit to spare just in case. You can pin this or just do it on the sewing machine, that's up to you. And I'm going to put a few more pins in. This is going to look very, very pretty. Ooh, just make sure you don't do like the straight over. You need to follow the rough edge, yeah, rough edges on top of each other. Now we're going to pop over to the sewing machine and sew this on. You want to have the open edge to your left. Now we're going to sew really close to that piping, and you really want to also pull from the back with your threads, because it's very likely the machine will get stuck right at the beginning and then it just hammers on the same spot, and we don't want that. Just keep really close to your piping. Now we're going to work the turn up. So the turn up without the piping, you're going to put this on like that, but we're going to pin from the other side. So the right sides are sitting inside, and we're going to pin the rough edges edge to edge on top of each other, and then we're going to sew this together again. There we go. Just pin it from side to side. And then we sew this together. And now we're going to sew exactly on here again, and then it's together. Don't forget we need to move the needle over, and there we go. Make sure that the rough edges sit right on top of each other. Now we can finish off our turn-ups. I'm just going to remove all the threads. I'm just going to do one, and then we're going to turn it. And of course this is going to be rather thick in here, so we're going to cut this back. And again, I think it's a nice way to cut it in stages. If you cut it all together, okay, you can do that as well. Especially if you want to be particularly speedy, but I'm going to take my time here and cut this back in stages. So I'm just cut the blue back a little bit more, just a tiny bit, so it doesn't all land in the same position. There we go, that looks good. I can do the red one as well. Wee bit. Now we're going to understitch this. Seam allowance faces into the lining, and stitch length 3, push the fabric apart and just sew in here, especially where you've got this top. It kind of wants to fold over like that. Don't let it. You're the master of your sewing machine. So there we go. And that gives you a really lovely edge. Now that we've understitched it, and it really holds that seam allowance really nicely to the back, you don't really need to iron this. What you want to do now is close the seam here. So we're putting these ends on top of each other, right sides together, and making sure that this lines up really nicely. And then we're going to close it with a centimeter seam allowance from one side to the other. And if you have a little bit of a discrepancy, I can just see I've got it there. We're just going to trim that off. Don't worry about it. It's so easy to get the seam allowance slightly wrong, especially when you put piping in. So don't worry about this whatsoever. This is absolutely fine. Now, before you sew this together, I forgot to say this. I've also removed the piping cord here, the same as we did on the front yoke. I pulled it out a little bit more than a centimeter and cut it off so it's really nice and flat. So the next step is to sew this together. Right, so 1 centimeter seam allowance, 3/8 of an inch. There we go. It says so on my sewing machine, 3/8. Put your turn up over your sleeve ironing board so that you can iron the seams apart. There we go. That would have been way too thick if you had any piping in there. Brilliant. Take it off and then simply turn it. Look at that. Very nice. And now I'm just going to put it over this way, actually from the outside, and give it another press all the way around. Look how gorgeous that looks. Lovely. Ooh, steam. What what you can do, don't have to though, just to make life easier when you're sewing together your sleeve in a minute, is to do a quick stitch all the way around to make sure that can't go anywhere. Oh, it's so pretty. That blue really works well. I didn't think it would be this pretty. This is gorgeous. So I'm just going to sew all the way around. Start anywhere really. Can be a nice big stitch. I have it on 3, that's perfect. Always sew from the inside so you can have a little bit of tension on it. And here I'm coming up a bit because I'm going to trim that. We know that already, don't we? That's important. Now we're going to put the cuff onto the corresponding sleeve. And it's really important that you don't mix these up because there's a front and a back. So put them in front of you so you've got the center of the sleeve in the middle and the center of the cuff in the middle. And then see what's cut away here a little bit more and what's cut away here a little bit more needs to obviously be one sleeve. And on this side we do exactly the same, cut away there a bit more and cut away here a bit more, so that belongs to that sleeve. So now you can't get them confused, and we're going to sew that together and that one. Now we're going to put this in together, and I'm just going to demonstrate what it will look like when it's done, right? The outside is the one that doesn't have the stitching on, okay? This is the understitching, so that lies to the inside. And then when it's done, it will sit like this. Really pretty. Wow. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to have a really clean edge on the inside, and we want to have the seam here lying on the inside. So if I just turn this so that we now have the right side facing the underside. I know that needs to go together. And I stick that in here. Don't worry, I'll take it back out and we can have another look. So if that was too fast, okay. So now this is how it's going to be sewn together. This one I've already done and pinned. Yeah, so the seam is on the outside. And if I take this back out, you can see that the upper side of my cuff sits on the underside of the sleeve. So now I'm going to line up my seams, and I'm going to pin it in to the point where I have my snips. It really is very, very simple, but of course putting on the cuff the wrong way around is something that happens all the time, and it happened to me when I first started doing this cuff. I had seen it in a shop done with a product, and I thought, this is so fantastic. I'm going to go home and I'm going to create a pattern just like that. That is beautiful. And of course, when I was trialing this until it became like I can do it in my dreams now. You could wake me up and I would go upper side to underside, you know. But not at first. I did get it wrong quite a few times, even though I made the pattern myself. Now on this side, we had secured the threads, so actually I can cut all these off so they're not in the way. There we go, because there's just so many threads here. There we go. I'm just going to cut these off, take them off. And now just pull it to fit. You also have a measurement on your pattern, but it really isn't that important, to be fair. Oops. Oh, no. That's the lower one. That's not important. It just needs to fit on, but it gives you some idea of how much you have to put it in. So I'll just gather it and then I pull it to fit. Put a pin in vertical to the seam, wrap your thread around the pin. There you go, it can't go anywhere. And then I'm just going to distribute this a little bit. There you go, from snip to snip. Beautiful. Pin this in. All I have to do now is sew it in all the way around. And we're going to do that, of course, on both our cute sleeves. It's going to be fabulous. Really nice. I'm just going to check that my gathers are in the same position both ways. They should really be, because you're working with the snips. Actually, this can go over a little bit here. Make sure they're the same. There we are. When you're sewing something in, like a sleeve or like the cuff here, you always want to turn it so you're working from the inside. Again, you don't need necessarily a centimeter seam allowance. You can go foot width, stitch length 2.5, and I'm working my way around here. Go, lock in your stitches. Now they're in, I'm going to get rid of all my threads down here so that it's you know, not such a big mess when I start putting my sleeves in. It's always a good idea to do that and work really tidily, step by step. I remember that when I started sewing, if I had too many threads on there, I would get so frustrated and confused by what was what. So tidy this up. And now we can go to the serger or overlocker, and we're going to serge this all the way around. So if you don't have a serger, you need to use whatever stitch is on your sewing machine that will finish this off. So an overcast stitch, or maybe you want to use a zigzag stitch. We're going to overlock it, and then we can turn it to the other side, and it's almost done. You just have to put it in. So from the inside all the way around, serge it. We are almost ready to put in the sleeve. Now the next step before we do is to stitch our seam allowance onto the sleeve. That's called understitching. Usually you do it to the lining, but because the seam here sits to the outside, we're doing it on the actual piece, right? So we're going in here and stitching it down, and therefore that will lie really flat, and when we turn it up, it'll sit all beautifully. It's a little bit difficult to get in here. Even worse for me, you have no idea where my head is. It's like on the other side there because the camera is right in front of it. But hopefully you can see this well. So pull this apart like you always do with understitching and just go over it. It's not going to be as tight as if I could actually look directly on what I'm doing, but as long as it's down, it's down. Over. There we go. Seam into it. Awesome. Almost the end. Whoops, got stuck a bit there. Secure your stitches and understitching done. It wasn't really that hard, and if you can really get closer to it with your head, it's even better. Oh dear, look at this. Can't do it any better with not actually sitting in front of it. Now I just have to remove all my threads so that it's nice and neat, and then we can put this sleeve in. We're leaving this down for now because it's very tight in there, and we're doing that stitching in the ditch to secure it when we're done. Otherwise it's too tight. Look, if I put this up and I'm sewing there, it's never going to work, right? So leave it down, and we can now put our sleeves in.